We think of the Middle Ages as a dirty, brutish time. 1,000 years of mud, plagues, and people throwing waste out of windows. We picture Viking warriors and grim-faced peasants who ate with their hands and settled arguments with axes. And some of that is true. But it's not the whole story. What if I told you they were obsessed with politeness? What if their rulebooks for behavior were more detailed and demanding than anything we have today? They had specific instructions on how to walk, how to talk, where to spit, and even how to handle an itch in public. These rules weren't just for kings and queens in their castles. Manuals on good manners were written for children, for merchants, for anyone trying to get ahead in a world built on reputation. Why? Because in a time before social media, your public behavior was your entire profile. It showed who you were, where you came from, and where you belonged. And when you look closely at these old rules, you find something surprising. They aren't just about control. They're about respect. They're about community. They're about acknowledging the humanity of the person sitting next to you, even when you have to share a cup and a single bowl of stew. Some of these rules are charming. They reveal a world trying its best to be civilized, using the only tools it had. They remind us of a time when sharing was not a choice but a necessity, and when a small gesture of courtesy could mean the difference between being an insider and an outcast. Number 21, why was your knife not for your mouth? You sat at a long wooden table. The air was thick, with the smell of roasting meat, wood smoke, and 100 unwashed bodies. You had your own knife. You probably brought it with you. It was not a dainty serrated steak knife from a matched set. It was your personal tool. You used it to cut your meat, to spear a piece of bread, and maybe earlier that day, to mend a leather strap or defend yourself in an alley. And the number one rule was simple. You did not put that knife in your mouth. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was a command found in almost every medieval etiquette guide. The book Les Contenances de la Table, a French text from around 1480, put it plainly, don't use your knife to carry food to your mouth like a shovel. Instead, you were to use the knife to cut a manageable piece of food and then pick that piece up with your fingers. Or, if you were fancy, you might use a pointed bodkin or the tip of your knife to spear it, but the blade itself never passed your lips. Why such a fuss over a simple tool? First, there was the obvious danger. These knives were sharp. They were often pointed daggers, personal weapons, as much as eating utensils. Shoving a sharp object into your mouth, especially in a crowded, jostling hall, was a good way to slice your lip or tongue. In an age without modern medicine, even a small cut could become infected and lead to death. Practicality was paramount, but there was a deeper reason, one that gets to the heart of what the medieval world considered civilized. The great sociologist Norbert Elias, in his groundbreaking 1939 book, The Civilizing Process, argued that the history of manners is the history of increasing self-control. He saw the rule about the knife as a perfect example. A beast, an animal, or a savage would use a tool in the most direct way possible. The civilized person, however, shows restraint. You create a buffer between your animalistic urges, like hunger, and your actions. Not putting the knife in your mouth was a small but powerful signal that you were in control of your impulses. You were not a brute, you were a person of refinement. The fork had not yet arrived to solve this problem. While forks existed, they were mostly seen in Italy and viewed with suspicion elsewhere. In the 11th century, when a Byzantine princess tried to introduce the fork to Venice, a cleric named Peter Damian condemned it as an instrument of excessive luxury and a sign of moral decay. He claimed her use of this foreign tool was an insult to God, who gave us natural forks at the end of our hands. For centuries, most of Europe agreed. The fork was seen as fussy, effeminate, and unnecessary. It wasn't until the 17th and 18th centuries that the table fork became common. Until then, your knife and your fingers were it. So this rule is surprisingly charming because it reveals a deep respect for a tool. Your knife was an extension of yourself, a constant companion. You cared for it, sharpened it, and understood its power. The rule wasn't just about not hurting yourself, it was about honoring the boundary between the wild world, the knife operated in, and the personal, vulnerable space of your own body. It was a sign of mindfulness. Today, we use and discard disposable plastic cutlery without a second thought. This medieval rule reminds us of a time when people had a more intimate and respectful relationship with the few objects they owned. But what don't we know? How often did people actually follow this rule, especially when they were hungry and no one of high status was watching? Did archaeological evidence from medieval rubbish pits show a different story, with commoners ignoring the niceties prescribed in books written for the nobility? When the fork was finally introduced, was the resistance to it purely about tradition, or was there a deeper, unspoken fear of losing a connection to the tactile experience of eating? And what does the universal adoption of the fork say about our own desire to distance ourselves from the primal reality of our food? Number 20, why couldn't you pet the dogs at the table? A medieval feast was a chaotic affair. The great hall was full of people, music, and noise. And it was also full of animals. Hounds and hunting dogs were a common sight, wandering among the tables, hoping for a dropped scrap of meat or a gnawed-on bone. They were not just pets, they were valuable working animals and status symbols. The temptation to reach down and scratch a friendly dog behind the ears must have been strong. Yet, the etiquette books were firm on this point. Do not touch the animals during dinner. A 15th century text, the Latili Childrenes Litil Book, warns the young diner, stroth no dog is, neither in the hall ne in the place where thou sits. In other words, don't stroke the dogs, not in the hall, not at your seat. This might seem cruel or fussy to us, but it was based on a very practical understanding of hygiene and order. The main reason was cleanliness. Your hands were your primary eating utensils. You used them to take food from a shared platter, to break bread, and to lift meat to your mouth. A dog's fur, no matter how beloved the animal, was considered dirty. It held fleas, dirt from the kennels or the courtyard, and who knows what else. To touch the dog and then dip your fingers back into the communal food supply was a major breach of etiquette. It was unsanitary and deeply disrespectful to your fellow diners. It was the medieval equivalent of double dipping. Beyond hygiene, the rule was about maintaining decorum. A feast was a performance of social order. The lord sat at the high table, guests were arranged by rank, and servants moved with precision. Dogs, by their nature, are disruptive. If guests were constantly petting them, feeding them, and encouraging them, it would turn an orderly meal into a chaotic free-for-all. The dogs would start fighting over scraps, jumping on people, and making a general nuisance of themselves. The rule was a way of saying, we are humans, they are animals. During this formal meal, we will maintain that distinction. This reflects a fascinating shift in the human-animal relationship. In many earlier societies, the line between humans and animals was more blurred. But the medieval courtly tradition, as detailed by writers like Erasmus of Rotterdam in his 1530 work De Civilitate Morum, Puerilium on Civility in Boys, was all about creating separation. It was about elevating human behavior above the baser instincts of animals. You know, you don't scratch yourself like a dog, you don't gnaw on a bone like a dog, and you don't play with dogs while you are engaged in the very human ritual of a shared meal. The charm here is in the quiet acknowledgement of a shared space. The dogs weren't banished, they were part of the scene. The rule wasn't no dogs allowed. It was, we must all behave with a certain dignity in this space, humans and animals alike. It shows a world where animals were an integrated part of daily life, not sequestered away in another room. The rule creates order not through exclusion, but through a mutual, if unspoken, agreement of roles. It's a charmingly practical approach to living with animals, recognizing both their presence and the need for human-centric rules at the dinner table. Yet, this leaves us with questions. How were these rules enforced? Was a guest publicly shamed for feeding a favorite hound? We have the books written by the elite, but what did the average soldier or servant do when the Lord wasn't looking? Did the types of dogs present change the rules? Was a lady's small lapdog treated differently from a massive wolfhound? And perhaps most fundamentally, was this rule about hygiene and order, or was it an early expression of anxiety about our own animal nature, a need to draw a clear line in the sand to prove our own superiority? What archaeological evidence might reveal the true diet of medieval dogs? Were they feasting on scraps from the high table or scrounging for rats in the bailey? Number 19, why did you wipe your mouth before you drank? Imagine you are sharing a single goblet of wine with 3 other people. The cup comes to you, passed down from the person of higher rank to your left. Before you take a sip, there is one critical action you must perform. You must wipe your mouth. Not after you drink, but before. This rule appears again and again in medieval conduct literature. The Book of Nurture, written by John Russell in the mid-15th century, gives explicit instructions to the butler and the guests. For the guests, the advice is clear. Wipe thy mouth full clean, whan thou wilt drinka. This wasn't about being dainty, it was a rule born from the absolute necessity of communal living. The most obvious reason was hygiene, or at least the medieval concept of it. Tables were messy, people ate greasy meats and thick stews, often with their hands. Your mouth and beard would be covered in grease and food particles. If you drank from the shared cup without wiping your mouth, you would transfer all of that grease and debris into the wine. The next person to drink would get a mouthful of your leftover dinner. It was disgusting, and it was a direct violation of the social contract. Wiping your mouth was a sign of respect for the people you were sharing with. It said, "I will not foul our common drink." This practice highlights the centrality of shared resources in medieval life. Individualism, as we know it, was not a dominant value. You shared a bench, you shared a bowl, and you shared a cup. This was true for peasants in a hut and for nobles in a great hall. The loving cup, or grace cup, was a powerful symbol of community, trust, and fellowship. It was passed around the table to seal oaths, celebrate victories, or simply affirm the bonds of the group. To contaminate that cup was to symbolically contaminate the bond itself. The act of wiping was also a visual cue. It was a public performance of cleanliness and consideration. You would take your napkin, if you were lucky enough to have one example, and make a deliberate gesture of wiping your lips. This showed everyone at the table that you were aware of the rules and that you cared about their comfort. In a society based on honor and public reputation, these small performances were everything. They were how you built trust and proved you belonged. What makes this charming is its profound sense of community. Today, we are obsessed with individual hygiene. We have our own glasses, our own plates, our own personal space bubbles. The idea of sharing a cup with strangers or even friends seems strange and unsanitary. The medieval rule doesn't try to create our modern sterile world. Instead, it creates a practical solution for a world where sharing was unavoidable. It finds a middle ground. It says, "We will be intimate and share, but we will do so with care and respect for one another." It's a small act of grace that makes communal living possible. It's a solution focused on making sharing work, rather than avoiding it altogether. But this raises so many unanswered questions. What did people without a napkin use? At a sleeve? The back of their hand? Did the quality of the wiping vary with social status, a noble's clean linen versus a commoner's rough spun tunic? Medical historians wonder if this practice, while well-intentioned, actually did anything to stop the spread of disease, or if the shared cup was a primary vector for illness regardless. But how did people react when someone forgot to wipe? Was there a silent judgment, a whispered comment, or a public rebuke? And as individualism began to rise during the Renaissance, was the decline of the shared cup a cause or a symptom of a society that was beginning to value the self over the group? Number 18, how could praising bad food be a virtue? You are a guest in a lord's castle. The stew is thin, the bread is stale, and the meat is tough. Your modern instinct might be to complain, to post a one-star review, or at least to make a sarcastic comment to your neighbor. But in the medieval world, your duty was clear. You must praise the food, loudly and sincerely. Etiquette manuals were very specific about this. A guest had an obligation to be gracious, and that obligation extended to the quality of the meal. In the Book of the Civilized Man Urbanus Magnus, a 13th century text by Daniel of Beccles, the author advises the reader to praise the host's feast regardless of its quality. To do otherwise was an insult of the highest order. Finding fault with the food was not a reflection on the cook, it was a direct criticism of the host's wealth, generosity, and social standing. This rule was rooted in the precariousness of medieval life. Food was not a guarantee. A bad harvest, a long winter, or a war could mean the difference between a feast and a famine. To provide a meal for guests was a significant act of generosity and a display of power. The food on the table represented the host's ability to provide and protect. To criticize it was to suggest he was failing in his fundamental duties as a leader and a provider. It could be interpreted as a political challenge. Furthermore, the host-guest relationship was sacred. It was governed by ancient laws of hospitality that demanded mutual respect. The host was obligated to provide food and shelter, and the guest was obligated to be grateful and cause no trouble. This bond was one of the core pillars of the social order. Criticizing the food was a violation of this sacred trust. It turned a gesture of peace and alliance into an occasion for conflict. The 12th century writer John of Salisbury noted that even uttering a word of complaint at table could be seen as an act of treachery. The performance of praise was also part of the social theater of the feast. And a good guest helped create a positive and celebratory atmosphere. By praising the food, you were contributing to the host's honor. You were helping to affirm his status in the eyes of everyone present. This was particularly important if other high-ranking guests or rivals were at the table. Your praise was a tool of social cohesion, helping to smooth over potential tensions and reinforce the existing hierarchy. The charm of this rule lies in its focus on gratitude over personal satisfaction. It prioritizes the relationship and the social bond above the quality of the meal. It reframes the act of dining together not as a consumer experience to be rated, but as a shared ritual of community. We live in an age of constant criticism, where everyone is a food critic. This medieval rule suggests a different path, one where the kindness of the gesture is more important than the perfection of the product. It's about appreciating the effort, not just the result. It is an etiquette of empathy. But what happened when the food was truly terrible, or even spoiled? Was there a subtle, non-verbal way to signal a problem without causing an insult? We have the prescriptions from the etiquette books, but we have few records of what people actually said in the moment. How did a host differentiate between sincere praise and obligatory flattery? Did this culture of mandatory praise sometimes lead to disastrous consequences, with hosts unknowingly serving tainted food because no one dared to speak up? And does our modern obsession with brutal honesty in our reviews come at the cost of the social grace and communal bonds that this medieval rule sought to protect? Number 17, why was breaking bread better than cutting it? At a medieval table, bread was not a side dish. It was central. It was used as a plate, a trencher, a spoon to sop up juices, and a substantial part of the meal itself. But how you handled that bread was critically important. You did not take a knife and slice off a piece from the main loaf. You broke it with your hands. This custom was ancient and deeply symbolic. The most powerful layer of meaning came from Christianity. At the Last Supper, as described in the Gospels of the New Testament, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples. This act became the cornerstone of the Christian Eucharist, or Holy Communion. For centuries, the image of breaking bread was synonymous with fellowship, community, and sharing in a sacred meal. Every time a person broke bread at the dinner table, they were, consciously or not, echoing this profound religious ritual. To cut the bread with a knife would be to violate the symbolism. It would turn a communal act into a sterile, individualistic one. There were also practical reasons. Loaves were often large and round, baked in communal ovens. They were meant to be shared. You know, the act of breaking a piece off and passing the rest of the loaf along was a physical manifestation of the sharing process. It was democratic and inclusive. Everyone took what they needed with their own hands. A knife, on the other hand, implies a more formal, controlled division of resources. The person with the knife has the power. Breaking the bread distributed that power among the diners. The quality of the bread mattered too. Medieval bread was not the soft, airy stuff we often eat today. It was dense, coarse, and had a thick crust. Breaking it with your hands was often the most effective way to portion it out. John Russell's Book of Nurture instructs the carver to present the bread to the Lord, who would then break off his own portion, setting an example for the rest of the table. This rule is charming because it is so elemental. It connects a simple physical act, tearing a piece of bread, to a deep well of cultural and spiritual meaning. It reminds us that the most basic gestures can carry the most weight. In our modern world, we often prefer things to be neat, precise, and individually wrapped. The act of breaking bread is a little messy. It creates crumbs. It's imperfect. But in that imperfection lies its beauty. It's a tangible representation of community, a shared experience that is both physical and symbolic. It's a reminder that we are all nourished from the same loaf. But this tradition raises some fascinating questions. You know, in a society so conscious of hierarchy, how was the act of breaking bread truly managed? Did the highest ranking person always get to break off the first and best piece? We know about upper crust, the term for the softest part of the loaf given to the nobility, but how was this negotiated in the moment? Were there disputes over the loaf? And as society became more secular, did the religious symbolism of breaking bread fade, turning a sacred act into a mere habit? We see the instruction in the books, but what was the emotional experience of the peasant for whom this bread was the bulk of his daily calories? Did he feel the weight of its symbolism, or was it just food? Number 16, what did your hands say about you before the meal? Before a medieval feast began, a crucial ritual took place. It didn't involve a prayer or a toast, but something far more practical: hand washing. This wasn't a private affair done in a separate room. It was a public performance, a key part of the ceremony of the meal. Servants, known as ewerers, would move among the guests carrying a ewer, a pitcher of water, a basin to catch it, and a linen towel. They would pour a stream of scented water, often infused with rose petals or other herbs, over the hands of each guest. The guests would wash, dry their hands on the communal towel, and only then would they be ready to eat. This was not just for the Lord and his family, it was an expectation for all honored guests. The Household Book of Edward IV, from the late 15th century, outlines the specific duties of the ewerer of the hall, showing how formalized this process was. The primary reason for this was, of course, hygiene. People ate with their hands. Forks were not in common use, and spoons were typically only for soups and pottages. Your fingers were your fork. Given the general lack of sanitation in daily life, washing hands before touching food that others would also be handling was a basic, if not entirely effective, form of germ control. It was a way to remove the most visible dirt from your hands before you plunged them into a shared platter of meat. But the ritual was more about social symbolism than scientific sanitation. The public nature of the act was key. It was a way of demonstrating to everyone that you were clean and therefore fit to join the communal meal. It was a gesture of respect to your host and your fellow diners. By washing your hands, you were showing that you were civilized, that you understood the rules, and that you would not contaminate the shared food. It was a social purifier as much as a physical one. The quality of the water and the towel also served as a status symbol for the host. A wealthy lord would have warm, scented water and fine linen towels. A lesser host might offer cold water and rougher cloth. The very act of providing this service was a display of wealth and attentiveness to the comfort of his guests. For the guests, participating in the ritual was an acknowledgement of the host's status and generosity. This rule is charming because it transforms a mundane act of hygiene into a beautiful and meaningful ceremony. We wash our hands today out of a private fear of germs. We do it quickly, often thoughtlessly, in a bathroom. The medieval ritual made hand washing a shared public moment of preparation. The scented water and the shared towel created a sensory experience that bonded the group together. It was a quiet moment of transition, marking the shift from the outside world to the sanctified space of the dinner table. It was a gesture that said, we are all entering this meal together, clean and ready to share. Still, we are left to wonder about the details. What did people do in less formal settings, in a tavern or a peasant's hut? Was hand washing still practiced, or was it a luxury of the elite? We know that physicians of the time, influenced by the works of Galen, believed in miasmas or bad airs, but their understanding of contagion was limited. How much did they truly believe the water was cleaning them in a medical sense versus a purely social or spiritual one? Did guests ever refuse the hand washing, and what would the social consequence be? And what was the life of a ewerer like, a servant whose entire job revolved around this single, repetitive, yet symbolically crucial act of purification? It's number 15, why was looking at your neighbor's plate so rude? You are seated at a crowded medieval table. The platters of food are being passed around, and you are curious. What did the person next to you manage to get? Did they get a better piece of meat? A larger portion of the pie? Your instinct is to glance over. But according to medieval etiquette, this was a serious mistake. The rule against staring at another person's food was surprisingly strict. Medieval conduct books often framed it in terms of greed and envy. To look at someone else's plate was to suggest that you were dissatisfied with your own portion and that you coveted what they had. The Baby's Book, a 15th century text aimed at teaching manners to young squires, advises, cast not your eye over the plate of your fellow diner. It was seen as a sign of a grasping, gluttonous nature. This rule speaks to the intense social anxiety that surrounded food and status. In a hierarchical society, the food you were served was a direct reflection of your social standing. The best cuts of meat, the finest white bread, and the most exotic spices were reserved for the Lord and his most important guests at the high table. Further down the table, the food became plainer and the portions smaller. Your plate was a public declaration of your worth. To stare at someone else's was to question the social order itself. It was like asking, why do they deserve that when I don't? This was a dangerous question to ask, even with just a glance. The rule was also about creating a sense of personal space and dignity in a very public and crowded environment. dining was not a private act. You were in close quarters sharing bowls and cups. The small portion of food on your trencher was one of the few things that was truly yours. For someone to stare at, it was an invasion of that small personal space. It was intrusive and judgmental. The rule was a way of ensuring that everyone could eat in peace, without feeling scrutinized or compared to their neighbors. It was a form of civil inattention, as the sociologist Irving Goffman would later call it, a way of showing respect by not paying too close attention. The charm here is in the rule's profound psychological insight. It recognizes that envy and comparison are poisons to a community. It teaches a form of mindfulness, encouraging the diner to focus on their own plate and their own experience, and to be grateful for what they have. In our age of social media, where we are constantly bombarded with curated images of other people's perfect meals and perfect lives, this medieval rule feels more relevant than ever. It is a quiet plea to stop comparing and to simply enjoy the food in front of you. It's an etiquette of contentment, but many questions remain. How is this rule enforced? A stare is a subtle thing. Was it the kind of offense that would be called out publicly, or would it just be noted and held against the offender's reputation? We know from archaeological studies of medieval diets that there were vast differences in nutrition based on social class. Did this rule against staring simply serve to make the lower classes more accepting of their meager portions, preventing them from seeing the true extent of the inequality? And in a world of scarcity, was it truly possible to suppress the natural human instinct to see who was getting more? Or was this rule, like many etiquette rules, an ideal that was constantly being broken in the messy reality of a hungry world? Number 14, where did the unwanted grisel go? The meat served at a medieval feast was not always the tender, prime cut we might expect. It was often tough, cooked on the bone, and full of gristle, fat, and sinew. So what did a polite diner do with the inedible bits? You couldn't just leave them on your trencher, the piece of stale bread that served as your plate, because you might end up eating it later. And you certainly couldn't spit it out onto the floor. The etiquette books provided a clear, if surprising, solution. You were to discreetly remove the unwanted morsel from your mouth with your fingertips. Then you placed it on the floor, but you didn't just drop it. You were supposed to place it neatly and quietly beside your chair. Some guides, like Erasmus's On Civility and Boys, suggest that if you must spit something out, you should turn away from the table and try to spit it under the bench, so as not to foul the dining area or splash your neighbor. The key was discretion. This might sound disgusting to us, but it was a practical solution in its time. The floors of most medieval dining halls were not covered in priceless carpets. They were typically stone or covered in rushes, straw, herbs, and flowers that were periodically swept out and replaced. The rushes helped to insulate the room, and the herbs like chamomile or meadowsweet helped to mask the smells. A small, discreetly placed piece of gristle on the floor would be swept away with everything else later. It was considered far more polite than leaving a pile of refuse on the table, which was a shared space. This practice also reveals something about the medieval concept of waste. They had a much more direct and less sanitized relationship with the byproducts of life. There were no garbage disposals or plastic-lined bins whisked away by sanitation workers. Waste was a visible part of the environment. The challenge was not to eliminate it, but to manage it with a degree of order and grace. Placing your food scraps on the floor was an organized system of disposal. It was far better than the alternative, which was throwing bones and scraps over your shoulder or leaving a mess on the table. The charm of this rule is in its frank pragmatism. It doesn't pretend that eating is a neat and tidy affair. It acknowledges the messy reality of dealing with a carcass and provides a clear, simple instruction for how to handle it politely. It finds a compromise between the reality of the food and the ideal of a civilized meal. It is an honest etiquette, one that doesn't hide from the less appealing aspects of eating. In a way, it's more genuine than our modern habit of hiding all our waste in a bin under the sink, pretending it doesn't exist. But this raises some puzzling questions. How discreet could this really be, especially in a boisterous hall with dozens of people all doing the same thing? Did the wandering dogs not immediately create chaos by fighting over these discarded bits? We have accounts, like one from the 16th century by a visitor to England who was shocked by the filth of the rush floors, which often accumulated layers of spilled beer, grease, and old food. Was this etiquette rule a noble ideal that, in practice, contributed to a rather unsanitary environment? And what does the archaeological record of these dining hall floors tell us? Can we reconstruct entire menus from the discarded bones and oyster shells found beneath the flagstones of a medieval castle? Number 13. Why was leaning on the table a sign of a bad character? In the modern world, leaning your elbows on the table is a minor sin of etiquette, something your grandmother might have scolded you for. In the medieval period, it was a much more serious offense. It was seen as a sign of laziness, disrespect, and even moral laxity. Conduct manuals are filled with warnings against it. A 15th century German text, Der Junker und der treue Heinrich, the Squire and the Faithful Henry, states that a well-bred person sits up straight and does not lean on the table like a common laborer weary from his work. The posture you held at the table was a direct reflection of your inner character and your social standing. To slouch or lean was to show that you were bored, inattentive, and lacked the discipline of a member of the upper class. The physical setup of the medieval dining hall helps explain this rule. Tables were often temporary structures, long boards, or boards laid across trestles. They were not always the most stable pieces of furniture. Leaning heavily on them could cause them to tip, spilling food and wine and creating chaos. The rule was partly a simple matter of physics and preventing a communal disaster. But the deeper meaning was social. A formal meal was, as we've seen, a performance. Your body was part of that performance. Sitting upright showed that you were engaged, alert, and respectful of the occasion and the host. It signaled that you were an active participant in the social ritual, not a passive consumer of food. The military culture of the aristocracy also played a role. Knights and lords were expected to maintain a disciplined, upright posture at all times, whether on a horse or at a table. Slouching was a sign of weakness and a lack of martial bearing. Furthermore, leaning on the table could be seen as an invasion of the communal space. With diners packed tightly together on benches, leaning forward with your elbows out encroached on your neighbor's room and could block their access to the shared platters. It was a physically selfish act. Sitting up straight was a way of respecting the shared nature of the table and the personal space of others. The reader of Les Contenances de la Table even connects it to gluttony, suggesting that one who leans forward is too eager for his food. This rule is surprisingly charming because it connects our physical posture to our social and moral state. It suggests that how we hold our bodies matters, that it communicates something important about our respect for ourselves and others. In our modern slouching culture, where we slump over desks and phones, this medieval call to sit up straight feels like a powerful reminder of the dignity of the human form. It's an etiquette of self-respect and physical presence. It tells us to be present, to be alert, and to take our place at the table with intention and grace. Of course, this leaves us wondering, were these rules applied differently to men and women? Or to the old and infirm, for whom sitting perfectly straight might have been a physical hardship? We have the formal rules, but accounts from chronicles and letters might tell a different story of how people actually behaved after the third goblet of wine. Did the design of chairs and benches evolve to encourage this upright posture, or did the furniture itself sometimes make it impossible to follow the rule? And is there a direct, traceable line from the knightly posture of the medieval court to the Victorian obsession with straight spines and the modern science of ergonomics? Number 12. How did you share a cup without sharing sickness? We've already seen the rule about wiping your mouth before drinking from a shared cup. But the very act of sharing a cup itself is a fascinating piece of medieval etiquette. In a world acutely aware of social hierarchy, the loving cup, or pacum caritatis, was a powerful tool for building fellowship and temporarily erasing social distinctions. But how did it work in practice? The ritual often began with the host. After the meal, a large, often ornate goblet filled with spiced wine would be brought to the high table. The host would stand, take a sip, and then pass it to the most honored guest on his right. That guest would sip and pass it on, and so the cup would make its way around the table, a tangible symbol of the trust and unity of the group. At weddings, guild meetings, and monastic dinners, this was a common and important ceremony. For example, the records of the Worshipful Company of Mercers in London, dating back to the 14th century, describe the regular use of a shared cup at their feasts to affirm their fraternal bonds. The etiquette surrounding this was precise. You were expected to stand when the cup came to you. You would hold it with both hands, a sign of respect, and also a practical way to avoid spilling from a heavy vessel. After you drank, you would wipe the rim of the cup with your napkin before passing it to the next person. This was the second line of defense, after wiping your own mouth, against passing on germs and grease. The person receiving the cup would often bow to the person passing it, a small gesture of thanks and acknowledgement. This practice was steeped in a tradition that predated medieval Christianity, likely having roots in Germanic and Celtic feasting rituals, where sharing a horn of mead was a way of binding warriors together. In the medieval context, it took on Christian overtones of the Eucharistic chalice, but its primary function was social. It was a performance of trust. In a world where poisoning was a real and present danger for the powerful, drinking from a shared cup was a declaration that everyone at the table trusted one another. It said, we're all friends here, this cup is safe. The charm of this rule is its radical sense of community. It runs completely counter to our modern sensibilities about hygiene and personal property. It forced a moment of intimacy and vulnerability. For a brief moment, the Lord and his lowest-ranking guest at the table were connected by the same physical object, drinking from the same vessel. It was a powerful social leveler. It's a beautiful idea that the act of sharing a drink could be a carefully choreographed ritual designed to build trust and overcome the rigid social barriers that defined every other aspect of life. But the questions are stark. How much did this practice contribute to the spread of disease? In an era of plagues and rampant infections, a shared cup seems like a terrible idea from a modern epidemiological perspective. Did people at the time make a connection between shared cups and illness, or was disease simply seen as an act of God, unrelated to such practices? We know from skeletal analysis that diseases like tuberculosis were common. Was the loving cup a culprit? Furthermore, what happened if someone refused to drink? Was it seen as a mortal insult, a declaration of distrust and enmity? We have romantic accounts of the tradition, but how often did it go wrong, ending in a drunken brawl or a political schism rather than fellowship? Number 11. Why was scratching an itch a social crime? Everyone gets an itch. It's a basic human sensation. But in the medieval world, what you did about that itch in public, especially at the dinner table, was a matter of serious social concern. You were not under any circumstances to scratch. The etiquette manuals are almost comical in their insistence on this point. The Boke of St. Albans, a 15th century compilation of treatises on hawking, hunting, and heraldry, also includes a section on manners that warns a gentleman never to scratch his head or other parts of his body at the table. But to do so was considered uncleanly and rude. Erasmus, in On Civility in Boys, goes into even more detail, advising that if one absolutely must scratch, it should be done discreetly, under the cover of one's clothes, and never in a way that draws attention. Why this intense focus on such a natural act? The primary reason was the association of scratching with filth and disease. Fleas, lice, and other parasites were a common part of medieval life for rich and poor alike. Constant scratching was a telltale sign that you were infested. It was an outward signal of poor personal hygiene. In a courtly setting where cleanliness was a performance of high status, openly scratching was like announcing that you were dirty and possibly diseased. It was deeply embarrassing. The rule was also connected to the broader civilizing process described by Norbert Elias. Scratching is an animalistic, reflexive behavior. To resist the urge to scratch, to suffer the itch in silence, was a demonstration of immense self-control. It showed that you were a master of your own body and its base impulses. You were not an animal, driven by instinct. You were a refined human being capable of rising above physical discomfort for the sake of social grace. This was the essence of courtly behavior. Finally, scratching was simply seen as ugly and distracting. A feast was supposed to be a pleasant and aesthetically pleasing event. Someone digging their fingernails into their scalp or arm disrupted that pleasantness. It was a jarring, unpleasant sight that was disrespectful to the other diners who were trying to enjoy their meal. The focus was on the comfort of the group over the comfort of the individual. Your personal itch was less important than the collective experience of the meal. The surprising charm of this rule lies in its demand for stoicism and self-mastery. It's a rather extreme form of mind over matter. It asks people to endure a physical discomfort for a higher social purpose. While it seems harsh, there is a certain dignity in it. It suggests a world where people were expected to be tougher, to have a greater command over their physical selves. It is the polar opposite of our modern culture, which prioritizes individual comfort above all else. It's an etiquette of endurance, but this raises some difficult questions. What about legitimate skin diseases like eczema or psoriasis that were poorly understood at the time? Were people suffering from these conditions unfairly stigmatized as being dirty or ill-mannered? We have prescriptive texts from the elite, But how did common people, who lived in much closer quarters with animals and had fewer opportunities for bathing, deal with this issue? Was this a rule that was impossible for anyone but the wealthiest to follow? And what were the secret tricks people used to relieve an itch without being caught? Was there a whole hidden language of discreet scratching going on under the tables of medieval Europe? Number 10. What was the salt cellar's secret message? Salt was a precious commodity in the Middle Ages. It was a preservative, a flavoring, and a symbol of wealth. It was so valuable that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in it, the origin of our word, salary. At a medieval feast, the salt was not in a shaker. It was presented in a large, often elaborate container called a salt cellar. And where you sat in relation to that salt cellar said everything about who you were. The salt cellar, often crafted from silver, pewter, or even gold, was the great divider of the medieval table. It was placed in the center of the high table, near the host. The most important guest nobles, high-ranking clergy, and honored friends were seated above the salt, between the salt cellar and the head of the table. Less important individuals, minor retainers, and anyone of lower status were seated below the salt. This was not a subtle distinction. It was a clear and public map of the social hierarchy of everyone in the room. To be invited to sit above the salt was a great honor. It meant you were considered an equal or a near equal to the host. It gave you access to the best food and the host's direct conversation. To be placed below the salt was a clear signal of your inferior status. The food was plainer, the wine was of a lesser quality, and you were socially and physically distant from the seat of power. The 16th century writer Thomas Nashi referenced this in his work, noting that the poor were left to sit below the salt. The etiquette of using the salt was also specific. You would not use your fingers to take salt from the cellar. Instead, you used the clean tip of your knife to lift a small amount and place it on your trencher. To dip a greasy knife, or even worse, a piece of meat directly into the salt cellar was a grave offense. It would contaminate the precious salt for everyone else. The salt, like the loving cup, was a shared resource that had to be treated with immense respect. This practice is charming because of its stark symbolic clarity. In a world with few written records for the common person, social status had to be performed visually and publicly. The salt cellar was a brilliant piece of social theater. It made the invisible hierarchy of the society visible to all. There was an honesty to it. You knew exactly where you stood. It's a far cry from our modern world with its subtle and often confusing social cues. The salt cellar didn't whisper about your status. It declared it for all to see. But what an uncomfortable system it must have been. This raises serious questions about the emotional impact of such a rigid public ranking. What did it feel like to be a young knight or a visiting merchant waiting anxiously to see on which side of the salt you would be placed? We have the rules, but what about the disputes? Did arguments and even duels ever break out over a seating arrangement? Historical records from the court of Louis XIV of France, though later, are filled with intricate battles over who got to sit on which type of stool, showing how seriously these matters were taken. And as society changed and a new merchant class began to rise, did the salt cellar become a major point of tension, a battleground between old hereditary nobility and new money? Number 9, why was a runny nose a moral failing? In the Middle Ages, a handkerchief was a rare luxury item. For most people, when your nose ran, you had two options: your sleeve or your hand. Medieval etiquette had a very strong opinion on which you should choose. The consensus in the conduct books was that using your hand was preferable to using your sleeve. The 15th century German poem Von den Sitten on manners instructs the reader to wipe his nose with his hand and then wipe his hand on his clothing somewhere discreetly. The reason was simple: the sleeve was too close to the shared food on the table. So wipe your nose on your sleeve and then reach for a piece of bread from the communal platter was considered utterly repulsive. Your hand at least could be wiped clean before you reached for food again. Erasmus, always the stickler for detail, took a slightly more refined stance in his 1530 book. He agreed that using one's cap or sleeve was boorish. He suggested that if a person must use their fingers, they should immediately turn away and wipe them on their tunic. However, he championed the use of a handkerchief as the most civilized option, noting that it was proper to turn away from the company when using it. This shows that by the early Renaissance, the handkerchief was beginning to be seen as a sign of a truly refined person. This intense focus on the management of bodily fluids was central to the medieval idea of civility. In a world without modern sanitation or a scientific understanding of germs, the rules of etiquette were the primary defense against disgust. Bodily fluids, a spit, mucus, sweat were seen as polluting. To manage them with discretion and control was a sign of high status. To let them run free or to handle them carelessly was a sign that you were no better than a peasant or an animal. The charm in this, strange as it seems, is in the attempt to create order and dignity in a difficult situation. We take tissues for granted. For them, a simple runny nose presented a complex social problem that required a prescribed solution. The rule shows a deep awareness of the other people at the table. The entire logic is based on not discussing your neighbor. It is an etiquette of consideration born from the close quarters of communal living. It's a reminder that even the most basic biological functions are social events when we live in community. But this opens up a Pandora's box of unanswered questions. How effective were these methods really? Wiping on your tunic seems only marginally better than wiping on your sleeve. Did these practices create a false sense of hygiene while still spreading disease? We lack detailed first-person accounts of how common people dealt with this. Did a farmer in his field or a blacksmith in his forge worry about such niceties? And as the handkerchief became a status symbol, did it create a new form of hygiene theater, where the wealthy could signal their superiority with a piece of cloth, while the poor were stigmatized for using the very methods that etiquette had previously prescribed for them? Number 8. How could silence be the best conversation? A medieval feast was a loud place. There were minstrels, jesters, barking dogs, and the chatter of dozens of people. But when it came to your own behavior at the table, one of the most important rules was to know when to be quiet. Specifically, you were forbidden from speaking with your mouth full. This is one of the few medieval etiquette rules that has survived completely intact into the modern day. Every child is taught it. But in the medieval context, it had a particular weight. The Latil Childrenese Lytel Boke puts it bluntly, "Thy mouth full speak thou not." The reason was partly aesthetic. No one wanted to see the chewed up food in your mouth. This was seen as uncomely or unattractive, but it was also deeply practical. Talking with your mouth full could cause you to spit food onto the table or onto your neighbors. In a setting where food was served on shared platters, accidentally spitting into the communal dish was a horrifying breach of conduct. It would ruin the food for everyone. The rule was a critical piece of social hygiene, ensuring the integrity of the shared meal. Beyond the practical, there was a moral dimension. To speak while eating was seen as a sign of gluttony and a lack of self-control. It suggested that your desire to speak was so overwhelming that you couldn't even wait to swallow your food. A person of refinement and discipline, on the other hand, would eat calmly, swallow, and only then contribute to the conversation. It was a matter of pacing and decorum. The 13th century Franciscan writer Gilbert of Tournai linked good table manners directly to a person's spiritual state, implying that a chaotic diner had a chaotic soul. And furthermore, being a good conversationalist at a medieval table meant being a good listener. The rules of discourse were often hierarchical. You were not to speak until a person of higher rank had spoken to you. You were to listen attentively to the stories and pronouncements of the host. Talking with your mouth full was a sign of disrespect because it suggested you weren't listening properly and were too eager to inject your own thoughts. The charm of this timeless rule is its simplicity and its focus on respect. It's not a complicated rule. It is a basic acknowledgement that we need to do one thing at a time, eat, then talk. It encourages a more mindful way of eating and a more deliberate way of conversing. It asks us to give our full attention to both the food and the company, but in their proper turn. Like, it is an etiquette of presence, reminding us to be fully in the moment, whether we are savoring a bite of food or listening to a story. Yet, we still have questions. In the noise and chaos of a great hall, how was this rule really enforced? Was it something that only applied at the high table, while the lower tables were a free-for-all? We have many tales of drunken feasts and boisterous celebrations, like the one described in the epic poem Beowulf, which seem to contradict this image of quiet, polite dining. How did medieval people balance the ideal of polite conversation with the reality of a festive gathering? And is our modern tolerance for things like business lunches and constant conversation during meals a sign of social progress, or have we lost the medieval art of simply and quietly sharing a meal? Number 7. Who ate first and why did it matter so much? At a medieval feast, the food did not all arrive at once. It came in courses, and within each course, a strict and visible order of service was followed. And the most important rule was this: the host, or the highest ranking person at the table, always ate first. And this was not a matter of the host being greedy, it was a crucial piece of social and political theater. The process began with a ceremonial tasting. Before the lord took a bite, his carver, his cupbearer, and his sewer, the servant in charge of serving the dishes, would often be required to taste the food and drink. This was in part a practical defense against poison, a constant fear for any medieval ruler. The survival of the taster was proof that the food was safe. The historical records of monarchs like King John of England are filled with references to tasters and the elaborate rituals they followed. Once the food was declared safe, the lord would take the first portion. This act symbolized his authority. He was the head of the household, the provider of the feast, and the top of the social pyramid. His taking the first bite was a reaffirmation of his power and his right to rule. It was only after he had been served that the dishes would be offered to the others at the high table, and then eventually make their way down to the lower tables. This procession of food was a physical manifestation of the feudal hierarchy, flowing downwards from the source of power. This rule also served as a gesture of generosity. By eating first, the host was essentially declaring the feast open and giving his permission for everyone else to eat. It was an act of hospitality. It showed that he was personally vouching for the quality and safety of the meal he was providing for his guests. His participation was a guarantee. The charm of this rule is in its powerful symbolism. It turns the simple act of eating into a declaration of leadership, responsibility, and trust. The host isn't just eating, he is performing his role as protector and provider. In a world that could be violent and unpredictable, this ritual provided a moment of order and reassurance. It made the structure of society clear and visible to everyone present. It's an etiquette of order, showing that a good society requires leadership and a clear chain of responsibility. But this ritual leaves us with some chilling questions. What was life like for a professional food taster whose job was literally to risk death at every meal? Historical accounts are sparse on the fate of these individuals. Did they receive hazard pay? Were they honored members of the household or expendable servants? And what happened in the tense moments when a host was dining with a known rival? Did the tasting ritual become more elaborate, more theatrical, a silent battle of wills played out over a platter of roasted peacock? And how did a host recover his authority if, for some reason, he was unable to eat first, perhaps due to a sudden illness? Could such a small breach in protocol lead to a genuine power struggle? Number 6. Why was the guest's departure the final test of manners? You have enjoyed a feast, you have praised the food, and you have engaged in polite conversation. Now it is time to leave. In the medieval world, how and when you departed was just as important as how you behaved during the meal. The final rule was to not overstay your welcome. This was especially critical if you were a guest staying for several days. Hospitality was a serious obligation, but it had its limits. The host was expected to provide for you, but this was a significant drain on his resources. A large group of guests with their servants and horses could quickly consume a household's stores of food, wine, and fodder. The 13th century guide, the Book of the Civilized Man, warns a guest not to linger so long that his host begins to wish him gone. A good guest was sensitive to the burden they were placing on their host. The departure itself was a formal process. You were expected to seek out your host and formally thank him for his hospitality. This was not a casual thanks for having me as you slipped out the door. It was a public performance of gratitude. You would praise his generosity, the quality of his household, and the honor he had shown you. This was your final opportunity to cement the social bond that the visit had created. Your parting words would be remembered and repeated. For very high-ranking guests, like a visiting king or duke, the departure was a major ceremony. The host and his entire household would assemble to see the guest off, often with an exchange of gifts. According to the chronicles of the French court historian Jean Froissart, who wrote in the 14th century, these departures were carefully managed events that affirmed political alliances and personal loyalties. The value of the parting gift was a direct measure of the success of the visit. The charm of this rule is its profound understanding of social grace. It recognizes that every relationship, even the sacred one between host and guest, is a balance of give and take. The rule encourages a deep empathy in the guest, asking them to see the situation from the host's perspective and to not take their generosity for granted. It frames the end of a visit not as a sad departure, but as a final, important act in the ritual of hospitality. It is an etiquette of awareness, reminding us to be mindful of our impact on others. But what about the guests who wouldn't leave? History and literature are full of stories of parasitic relatives and hangers on who took advantage of a host's generosity. How did a medieval lord politely, or not so politely, get rid of an unwanted long-term guest? Were there secret signals or codes used by the household staff to indicate that a guest's time was up? And what was the economic reality of this system? Did powerful lords essentially run a network of high-class lords, essentially run a network of high-class hotels for their political allies? How much did the fear of being seen as a poor host trap people into providing hospitality far beyond their means? Number 5, why did you give the best morsel to your neighbor? At a medieval table, especially if you were a person of high status, you might be presented with a whole roasted bird, a large piece of meat, or a pie. Your duty was not to hoard the best pieces for yourself. Instead, a key mark of good breeding was to carve and serve others, offering the choicest morsels to your neighbors. The hosts, or a designated carver, would perform the main carving for the table. But this principle of sharing extended to individual diners as well. If you were given a small bird like a quail, it was considered good manners to offer a portion of it to the person sitting next to you. And John Russell, in his Bouquet of Nurture, gives detailed instructions on how a gentleman should carve for others, showing that this was a highly valued skill. He advises on how to break that deer and unlace that coney rabbit, all for the benefit of the company. This act of sharing was a powerful demonstration of generosity and high status. It showed that you were not a greedy, gluttonous person who was only concerned with your own appetite. It signaled that you were a provider, a person of substance, who could afford to be generous. In a world where food could be scarce, giving it away was a significant display of wealth and power. It was a performance of nobility, proving that you had the refined character suited to your rank. This was also a way of building social bonds. To offer a piece of choice meat to your neighbor was a personal gesture of friendship and respect. It created a small, positive interaction that helped to weave the social fabric of the table. It turned the act of eating from a purely individual act of consumption into a collective act of sharing and mutual care. This was especially important when seating arrangements placed potential rivals or strangers next to each other. A shared piece of chicken could be a small peace offering. The charm of this rule is its simple, unadorned kindness. It is the opposite of the competitive, individualistic mindset that can sometimes dominate our modern culture. It suggests that the best way to enjoy what you have is to share it. The rule reframes status not as something you have, but as something you demonstrate through acts of generosity. It is a beautiful and simple way to build community, one small piece of food at a time. It is an etiquette of generosity, but this practice also raises complex social questions. How did one decide who to share with? Was it always the person of higher rank, or was it sometimes an act of patronage to a social inferior? We read the ideal in the etiquette books, but what was the reality? Did people resent having to give away the best bite? And what happened if your offer was refused? Was that seen as a snub? The pressure to perform this generosity must have been immense. Did it lead to a kind of competitive giving, where nobles tried to outdo each other in their magnanimous carving, all for the sake of reputation? Number 4, why was gossiping about your host the ultimate sin? During a medieval feast, there was plenty to talk about: politics, battles, harvests, and the latest court scandals. But there was one subject that was strictly off limits: any form of criticism or gossip about your host or his household. To speak ill of the man whose bread you were eating was considered the height of treachery. The laws of hospitality created a sacred bond. The host offered you protection, food, and shelter. In return, you owed him your loyalty, at least for the duration of your stay. To violate this bond by spreading rumors or complaining about his arrangements was a profound betrayal. It was seen as a moral failing of the worst kind. The 12th century writer Peter of Blois wrote that a person who criticizes his host has a dog's nature, snapping at the hand that feeds him. This rule was not just about being polite, it was about survival. A person's reputation or honor was their most valuable asset in the medieval world. A lord's authority depended on his reputation for strength, wealth, and generosity. And gossip that undermined that reputation was not idle chatter, it was a political attack. A guest who was caught gossiping could be accused of being a spy or a saboteur, trying to weaken the host in the eyes of his allies and enemies. The consequences could be severe, from being banished from the court to imprisonment or worse. The prohibition extended to everything. You didn't complain that your bed was lumpy. You didn't whisper that the wine was watered down. You didn't make fun of the host's wife or children. You presented a front of complete contentment and gratitude. This was part of the performance of being a good guest. Your role was to contribute to the honor of the household, not to detract from it. The charm of this rule is its emphasis on loyalty and the sanctity of the private sphere. It suggests that a person's home should be a safe space, a sanctuary from the criticism and judgment of the outside world. It asks us to suspend our critical faculties and simply accept the hospitality offered with grace and gratitude. In our modern era of instant online reviews for everything, where every guest is a potential critic, this medieval demand for absolute loyalty to your host feels like a radical call for kindness and discretion. It is an etiquette of trust, but this raises some troubling questions. Did this rule of silence create an environment where powerful but abusive hosts could act with impunity? If a guest witnessed injustice or cruelty within a household, did the laws of hospitality force them to become complicit through their silence? We know that medieval courts could be dangerous places full of intrigue and violence. How did this rule square with a person's own moral code or their duty to a higher authority, like a king or the church? And what were the subtle, non-verbal ways that a guest could signal their displeasure or warning to others without breaking the explicit rule against gossip? Was there a whole language of raised eyebrows and meaningful glances that we can no longer decipher? Number 3, what did your sleeves have to do with your supper? Medieval clothing for the wealthy could be extravagant. One of the most prominent features of high-status fashion from the 14th century onwards was the long flowing sleeve. These sleeves, known as pendant or hanging sleeves, could be so long that they trailed on the floor. They were a conspicuous sign of wealth. You clearly didn't do any manual labor if you could wear sleeves like that. But they presented a major problem at the dinner table. The rule was simple and absolutely essential: keep your sleeves out of the food. It sounds obvious, but with sleeves that long and tables crowded with shared dishes, it was a real challenge. Dragging your magnificent but unwieldy sleeve through a communal bowl of stew or across a platter of meat was a catastrophic failure of etiquette. It was messy, unhygienic, and disrespectful to everyone else at the table. It soiled your expensive clothes and contaminated the shared food in one clumsy motion. Etiquette guides and illustrations from the period sometimes showed diners carefully rolling up or knotting their sleeves before a meal. For some garments, the pendant part of the sleeve was actually a separate piece of cloth, a tippet, that could be detached or thrown back over the shoulder to keep it out of the way. The need to manage one's sleeves required constant awareness and physical control. It was another way of demonstrating your refinement. A clumsy person would constantly be making a mess, while a graceful courtier could manage their extravagant clothing with ease. This seemingly trivial rule is a fascinating window into the material culture of the Middle Ages. It shows how fashion and manners were deeply intertwined. The clothing was designed to signal status, but it then required the wearer to develop a new set of physical skills and etiquette rules to manage it. Your ability to eat cleanly while wearing impractical clothing was a performance of your sophistication. The charm of this rule is its connection to the physical world. It's not an abstract moral principle. It's a practical problem that needs a physical solution. It reminds us that etiquette is not just about what you say, but about how you move your body and interact with the objects around you. It's an etiquette of physical grace, a small ballet performed at the dinner table. It shows a world where people were deeply conscious of their clothing, not just as a covering, but as an active participant in their social life, an obstacle to be overcome with elegance. But what don't we know? How did the fashion for long sleeves actually start? Was it a purely aesthetic choice, or did it have some other symbolic meaning we've lost? We have the rules for the wealthy, but what about the working classes who wore more practical clothing? Did they have their own set of etiquette rules related to their work garments? And can we see in the archaeological record evidence of this problem in, for example, food stains preserved on the sleeve fragments of surviving medieval garments? What did the rise of more tailored, less flowing fashions in the later Renaissance do to the rules of table manners? Did the fork become popular partly because It was a cleaner tool to use when wearing elaborate lace cuffs. Number 2, why was your spoon the loneliest utensil? At a typical medieval meal, you had your knife and you had your hands. But what about soup, pottage, or sweet custards? For these, you had a spoon, yet the spoon occupied a strange and lonely place in the medieval utensil hierarchy. The rules surrounding its use were very specific. First, you often had to bring your own. Just like the knife, a spoon was a personal item. A wealthy host might provide spoons for his guests, but it wasn't a guarantee. Inventories of medieval households, like that of the English knight Sir John Fastall from the 15th century, list dozens of silver spoons, indicating they were valuable personal possessions. To be given a spoon at birth, often from a godparent, the origin of being born with a silver spoon in your mouth, was to be given a valuable asset for life. The etiquette for using the spoon was precise. You did not leave your spoon in the shared serving bowl. This was a major offense. It was unsanitary, as your spoon had been in your mouth, and it was inconvenient for the next person. You were to fill your spoon from the main dish, bring it to your own bowl or trencher, and eat from it there. You never ate directly from the large communal pot. Furthermore, you did not slurp or make noise with your spoon. This was considered churlish or peasant-like. A person of good breeding ate their soup silently. And after you were finished with your spoon, you did not leave it in your empty bowl. You were expected to wipe it clean and place it neatly beside your dish. Since it was your personal property, you were responsible for keeping it clean and ready for the next course, or for taking it with you when you left. What's charming about these rules is the dignity they give to a simple object. The spoon wasn't a disposable tool, it was a personal possession to be cared for. The etiquette surrounding it reinforces the themes of respect for shared resources and personal responsibility. The rules create a zone of hygiene and order around the messiest of foods. They transform the simple act of eating soup into a performance of discipline and cleanliness. It's an etiquette of ownership, highlighting a time when possessions were few, valuable, and deeply personal. But the history of the spoon leaves us with questions. While wealthy people had silver spoons, what did the poor use? Corn, wood, or perhaps just a piece of bread. Archaeological finds of common medieval spoons are much rarer than those of the rich. How did the design of the spoon change over time, and what does that tell us about the types of food people were eating? We know the apostle spoon, with its image of a saint on the handle, was a popular christening gift. Did this religious association affect the way people treated their spoons? And was there a social hierarchy of spoons themselves, with the material and ornamentation of your spoon signaling your place in the world, just as much as your position relative to the salt? Number 1, why was the most important rule the one we've forgotten? We've looked at 20 specific rules, from knives and dogs to sleeves and spoons, but they all point to one single overarching principle of medieval etiquette, a principle that is perhaps the most charming and the most alien to our modern world. The ultimate rule was this: you must constantly and actively acknowledge the humanity of the person next to you. Every rule we've examined is, at its core, about navigating a shared space and shared resources with respect. Don't foul the shared cup. Don't contaminate the shared salt. Don't block your neighbor's access to the shared platter with your elbows or your sleeves. Don't disgust them by scratching or talking with your mouth full. Share your best food. Treat your host's generosity. Wash your hands publicly to show you are clean enough to join the group. All of these rules flow from the fundamental reality that you are not eating alone. You are part of a community, and your actions have a direct and immediate impact on the people around you. This is a stark contrast to our modern dining etiquette, which is often focused on individualism. We have our own plates, our own glasses, our own cutlery. Our main goal is to not make a fool of ourselves. Medieval etiquette was different. Its main goal was to not dishonor or inconvenience the group. It was fundamentally other-directed. As the historian Stephen Mennel points out in his work on the history of food and taste, the medieval focus was on the interdependence of the diners. This principle was born of necessity. Life was communal to a degree we can barely imagine. You lived, worked, and ate in close proximity to others. There was no escape into a private world. The rules of etiquette were not a luxury, they were a survival mechanism. They were the social technology that allowed people to live together in crowded, often difficult conditions without constantly descending into conflict. They were a way of making intimacy bearable. The charm here is profound. This forgotten principle is a powerful antidote to the loneliness and alienation of modern life. It reminds us that we are not islands. It suggests that the highest form of civility is not to have the most refined personal habits, but to be the most considerate of our neighbors. It is an etiquette of connection, one that sees the dinner table not as a place for individual refueling, but as a space for the active creation and maintenance of community. It tells us that the person across the table is not an obstacle or an audience, but a partner in the shared sacred ritual of a meal. But this raises the biggest questions of all. Have we lost something essential in our pursuit of privacy and individualism? We gained hygiene and personal space, but we may have lost a sense of deep, necessary connection to the people around us. Can we ever get that back? Or has the structure of our society changed so fundamentally that this kind of communal etiquette is impossible? And as we look to the future, with its challenges of resource scarcity and global community, is there something we can learn from the medieval feasting table? Perhaps their greatest, most charming rule, the one that asks us to see our own meal reflected in our neighbor's eyes, is the one we need to remember most of all.